In January 2025, I made a video outlining the many problems with the Crusade Kickstarter as a way to explain to my viewers why I personally chose to stay away from making any Crusade content, and as a way to keep the developers accountable to the people who backed their Kickstarter. However, in that video, I made the mistake of assuming people would take the information at face value, since everything I talked about was verifiably true. Unfortunately, amongst the Crusade community, they have been reiterating the misinformation that all the STL files have already been fixed a year ago, implying that the issues regarding bad presupports and Resin traps that I talked about were outdated. This resulted in baseless accusations that I was grifting or even outright lying. I'm going to use this video to provide further proof of my claims and to set the record straight. Furthermore, there has been a misleading narrative that claims that the only people who got struck with DMCA takedowns by Brandshield on behalf of Crusade have been illegally reselling copies of the official Crusade miniatures, or otherwise committing copyright infringement, which in this video I'm also going to disprove and show that Crusade has actually been abusing the DMCA takedown process. Furthermore, I will talk about the controversy around their community license that they have finally released, along with a few other topics. Overall, this video will have the same amount of matter-of-fact approach as the first one. This video will be quite lengthy, but considering these serious allegations, I'm sure you can understand that this needs sufficient time to lay out all the evidence. As you know, I bring receipts to prove this stuff, and trust me when I say it will get really bad. I'm sure as you watch this video, you will come to understand why this warranted a second video. Overall, their community has shown an extreme dismissiveness of anyone being critical of the developers, either insisting that people should just stop talking about it, or ridiculing them or gaslighting them. Please keep in mind, this is not part of the accusations against the developers themselves, as I don't think that would be fair, but it is important to mention for context. So far, any creator critical of Crusade, no matter how reasonable, has been unanimously labeled as a grifter, making drama slop ragebait for YouTube clicks. Case in point, when Discord's Miniatures, a channel covering anything to do with tabletop games, made a video on the topic. In this video, she was being very reasonable and actually explains that she enjoys playing Crusade.
For many people, the first time they're seeing anything about Crusade, and honestly, it's coming to define Crusade in the minds of many wargamers, which is a huge pity, because Crusade is an awesome game. It has a great community, it plays really well, the art is fantastic, the setting is amazing, and I do think that Factory Fortress meanwhile.
She thinks it's a great game that despite its problems, she wants to succeed, and she has previously covered Crusade in a really positive light as well. When she shared her opinion on the Discord server regarding the community license, she was greeted by the lovely message that her videos are trash clickbait and she should get a job, with other users upvoting the message and piling in on the slander. So please realize that they have no issue baselessly slandering and badmouthing the people who actually support the game, and I'm sure you can imagine what they will say about people like me and others who do not. I do not think it's reasonable to hold the developers personally accountable for this, as it's not an official server and they are not moderators there. However, one interesting fact to note is that just until December 2025, they had direct links to the Crusade Discord, Facebook and Reddit on their official website. Also in the past, they have publicly proclaimed to stand behind the decisions of the moderators when it came to banning people. Considering how Crusade always claimed to be community driven, and the developers themselves having thousands of messages on these forums, I think it's interesting to note that starting 2026, they are apparently silently distancing themselves from their own communities, because you can no longer find these links to their Reddit, Discord or Facebook on their website. Overall, the way they initially were amicably engaging with the fans now stands in contrast to the increasingly corporatized way of communicating. With that out of the way, let's dive into their actual wrongdoings. What I can hold the developers accountable for is that they have now officially doubled down on the false claim that all models have already been fixed a year ago, at the start of 2025. In a response to a question on Kickstarter, they claim that they have not received any reports of issues since then, which you all know is just blatantly false. This cannot just be explained away as some miscommunication within their team either, as this was said by the very same person who I initially informed and who responded that they would get the issue sorted. At that point, I had only double checked a few models and inferred that if the models they claim to have been fixed still have problems, then it's fair to assume that the entire range needs to be double checked, and that is exactly what I told them they should do. And because I have access to some of the models on my mini factory, I can check at any time if they have actually updated the models, which they of course have not. And from the models that I did not buy directly from my mini factory, I've been able to check that I have the latest version by checking the file properties and seeing the creation date. considering that I specifically mentioned having purchased some Crusade models directly from my mini factory and even pointed out to a specific model as an example of having these issues, it would have been really easy for anyone to verify that what I was saying was indeed true. So the levels of mental gymnastics to defend Crusade on this are simply mind-boggling. So because they are now officially doubling down, I have researched their entire range of miniatures and made a full list of all these issues with my notes. And before making this list public, I sent it out to the developers both on Discord and their official email to give them one final chance to set things right, but they didn't even bother with a response this time. Seeing that they seem completely unwilling to take any accountability on this and are in fact demonstrably lying, I think it's warranted to go over all the proof publicly, so as to warn people about the state of these STL files and the horrible quality control of Crusade in general. Unfortunately, bad pre-supports and resin traps are very common within the digital miniature market at large, and to this day, things like these are kinda expected when you're downloading free models or even when buying STL files. But for a $3 million Kickstarter who claim to be industry professionals, hiring professional sculptors and having their models professionally pre-supported and printed, people will wrongfully assume a level of professionalism that Crusade miniatures simply do not have. To have someone who can double check my claims, I've been in contact with another YouTube channel specialized in miniature printing called Once in a Six Side. He also has a website called MiniRater that has a rating and review system for miniature sculptors. He is actively working to inform people and to improve the industry standards, and he definitely knows what he's talking about. And basically anyone else I've shared my findings with also agrees that these issues should be fixed because they are sloppy at best and straight up negligent at worst. Despite being informed that their models are not up to professional standards, they continue to send out subpar quality to their backers. And they also continue to sell both the files and physical prints of these models. Keep in mind, Crusade files are definitely not cheap, and the developers themselves have said that people should expect the highest quality. According to my own report of issues from going over almost every single model within their entire range and checking them with UV tools, I'm aware that UV tools can give false positives, but I've designed a lot of 3D printable models myself, and from experience I know what to look for. And when there was any doubt in UV tools, I actually looked at the model in Blender or in the slicer software to confirm the issue. The models with resin traps of various sizes is closer to 25%, and models with unsupported islands throughout their entire range is as much as 40%. This does not mean that every model will immediately explode or fail to print, that just means these issues are there one way or another, and I will explain the varying degrees of severity this can result in. I have screen recorded the entire process of going over all their models. I'm already ignoring any really minor issues for the sake of not nitpicking needlessly, otherwise the number would be higher. For example, if a really large and complicated model has only a handful of minor unsupported islands, then I'm willing to overlook that just to be fair about it. Another thing I noticed about the list is that for several of the models with reported resin traps, they downplayed the severity of it, presumably to make it look less bad than it actually is. The Brazen Bull, Artillery Witch and Warwolf definitely had resin traps, but they are only labeled as possible resin traps. Likewise, the Trench Cleric, Amalgam, Sniper Priest and Communicant are labeled as having cavities, which is just another word for saying resin trap. Heretic Trooper is labeled as Tiny Channel Issue, which is once again just another way of saying resin trap. Anointed has a gap in abdomen, which is also a resin trap. Shrine Anchorite arms need to be filled is also just a rephrasing for resin traps. Combat Engineer and Yeoman are downplayed as minor resin traps. So not calling these things for what they are seems very misleading.
You have to remember that from the point of view of the end user, they don't really care, and they shouldn't care. Are we a giant multi-billion-dollar company or a dinky less than 10 people the outfit like us? They just care about the quality of the product. I mean, why would you spend your hard-earned money if the quality isn't world-class? That's our problem. It's our problem to find a way to get world-class product out there. It's not the fans' job. That's our job.
If you consider that even by their own admission there were already 12 reported models with resin traps on the original release, and considering that they have roughly a bit more than 100 models, that means that at least 10% of the models had reported resin traps upon release. And instead of making sure everything was perfect before launch, they have outsourced the quality control of their models onto their backers. Given that they have also publicly admitted to not even checking every model, it should really come as no surprise that there are way more issues than have been reported upon. So while I can confirm that several of these issues have indeed been fixed, I must once again reiterate that a lot of issues still remain. Human Body 4, the very same model that I used as an example to inform the devs, claims to have its resin traps fixed, but the second largest resin traps in the lower right leg still remains. Several of these reported models that were fixed had relatively minor resin traps. This clearly shows that both the community and the developers thought it was worthwhile to fix those minor issues, and some of these were even smaller than the ones that are still there, even by their own standards. There is no reason why the ones that I'm reporting on should not also be fixed. If you have purchased these models and have already printed them and you're wondering why it's possible that you have not had any issues, first of all, resin traps are initially invisible from the outside, so even if a model prints successfully, that doesn't mean that they are not there. It can take up to years before the gases inside build up enough to crack open a model, and this depends on many factors like the size and the position of the cavity, the type of resin, the thickness of the model, room temperature, the pixel density of the screen and the exposure time. Results can vary all the way from nothing happening to your model ever, to pimples or cracks appearing on the model surface, it's slowly seeping off resin over time, to full blowouts. Considering the amount of factors at play here, you simply cannot predict when and to what extent it will become a problem. And this is not just limited to their miniatures, but also to their terrain, which arguably has even worse resin trap than the miniatures. Fortunately, the physical terrain for their Kickstarter is printed in FDM plastic, but the pre-supported files indicate that they also intended people to print these with resin as well. If you're lucky, small cavity will be cured over during the print, but this is not a guarantee, and considering the amount of variables and thousands of people printing these at home under different circumstances, there should just be no resin traps in the models, period. This really shouldn't even be a discussion when dealing with a toxic chemical. As for the unsupported islands, if those are small enough, then the model will usually be at least printable without visible issues. That is why, despite having numerous unsupported islands, a model can pass the test printing phase, but this is only the very bare minimum of quality control. Just like the resin traps, there are some nuances, as the amount of unreported islands in UV tools can vary depending on the screen resolution and layer height that it's been sliced with. But I have sliced all of them models with a very common Elegoo Mars 2 Pro with a default 0.05 layer height, so the result should be very representative. Unsupported islands often end up getting stuck to the FEP sheet, and this essentially causes an effect similar to a dead pixel, because for the subsequent layers, the cured resin over these pixels will block the UV light from reaching the liquid resin, and this can cause unexpected print failures later on in the model, or even in the next batch of models. Alternatively, these can detach from the FEP to then float around in the resin, and in the worst case can even puncture the FEP sheet. Anyone who does 3D printing knows that a leaking resin vat is an absolute headache to deal with and can potentially even damage the screen. If you're only printing a few models, this may not cause any issues, but the more often you print these models and the more numerous and large the unsupported islands are, this can quickly get out of hand and will get worse and worse until you run a vat cleaning program. This cures one complete layer, which is then completely removed from the vat. However, this can waste a lot of resin and is a very messy and annoying process that nobody wants to regularly deal with, and it does not fix damage already inflicted upon the FEP sheet. By skimping on quality control of their supports, they have offloaded these issues to their customers, which is really not acceptable, because depending on how many people will be printing these files, it will ultimately cost hundreds if not thousands of failed print hours, and additionally cost for the wasted resin, isopropyl alcohol, FEP sheet replacements and potentially even damaged screens. For a project the size of Crusade, this actually amounts to a quite significant amount of economical damage. And just to prove this point, having none of these issues is absolutely possible. For reference, if you put my latest model through UV tools, it reports 0 resin traps, and there are also no unsupported islands larger than 10 pixels, which I think is an acceptable standard and is also extremely microscopic compared to the ones that Crusade models are absolutely riddled with. Fixing resin traps is literally as easy as putting the miniatures in Blender, applying a remeshing modifier and exporting it, to then double check the file in UV tools, and if there are any remaining issues you can easily fix those by hand. This entire process takes like 10 minutes per model, so there is really no excuse not to do it. I was wondering how this could all have gone so wrong, so I reached out to Atlas 3D, which is the company that Crusade claims are responsible for all the pre-supported work of their miniatures, and they were kind enough to explain their business process to me in detail. Atlas 3D has a lot of clients in this industry and do pre-support for hundreds of miniatures each month. They offer this sort of work at scale month after month for an economically viable price affordable to different sculptors. And in a market where margins and profits are generally small, this means that the benchmark for their quality control is limited to whether the model was successfully test printed. They do not use software like UV tools to double check their support work for unsupported islands. They also pre-support the models as provided to them, which means that any mesh errors and resin traps are the responsibility of the sculptors themselves, and although they may inform a creator about this if they spot any issues, they generally do not fix those things. Atlas 3D was very upfront that this was the reality of the service and quality that they were offering. In every folder of Crusade miniatures there is a readme file with an Atlas 3D logo, claiming that they have pre-supported the model. However, I was informed that they were initially only responsible for the files with the SKU prefix of TCPM. By and large, the models with prefix TCDM have not been pre-supported by them, so for those we have to assume that they have been pre-supported in-house by Factory Fortress themselves or another party which Crusade has not disclosed anywhere. What these prefixes stand for I do not know, but it's very misleading that they include the Atlas 3D logo for all of their models. The quality and pre-supports are all over the place, with some models being done fairly competently, while others are basically on par with auto-generated supports, which are known for having a lot of unsupported islands. In fact, by merely tweaking some of Lychee's auto support settings, I've been able to generate almost identical results as some of the original pre-supported models. There were several models that have initially been hollowed out that absolutely didn't need to be hollowed out in the first place. One example of this would be the Observer. For reference, this is literally a model the size of a Space Marine. It makes no sense to hollow this out, as at most it only saves a few cents of resin and comes with a whole lot of downsides. There is no chance that this was done accidentally, as there are even supports inside of the model and the drain holes are placed by hand with slices of air, so it cannot have gone unnoticed. Furthermore, when you scroll through the model, it's extremely obvious that the drain holes are tiny. I've had this model test printed by someone else who indeed confirmed that this was a pain in the ass. There is a large chance that even after bathing and curing the model, it will still likely leak resin, and it's downright impossible to get the inside completely cured, as the UV light will barely be able to shine through the drain hole. So yeah, let that absolute brain dead decision sink in, because the fact that this has even passed through quality control in the first place is just shocking. The issue was already pointed out all the way back in December 2024, so it's not just me saying this, and one of the developers even outright agreed that there should be no point in hollowing out such small models, and despite evidence to the contrary, continued to claim that they didn't. Let me quote his reply. To confirm, no, we have not hollowed the smaller models. As people have pointed out, it's not worth it for the tiny amount of resin saved, and most of the smaller ones wouldn't have space on them for a proper drainage anyways. Despite publicly lying about the state of their models, Crusade made the right decision and fixed it. So the latest version available on my main factory is no longer hollowed out. But if you think they learned their lesson, you would be wrong, because the latest STL releases also have the exact same issue. Gothic Warlock and Mamluk Varus are the last two STL files released in 2026 to complete the Kickstarter factions, and they are also hollowed out, with no solid alternative included in the files. The Warlock in particular has an extremely narrow hole in the body, causing a large cavity in the upper body that is just really hard to drain. Once again, had someone else print the model, it still had liquid resin inside, which proves the point that this is a really bad idea. So once again, absolutely no consistency and no quality control, even on models that have recently been released. This lack of consistency is definitely a red flag, indicating the lack of care and attention that has been given to this entire process. The main problem is that the Crusade developers have absolutely no clue how any of this works. They rely completely on a motley crew of various different sculptors and suppliers to make all the models. They themselves don't have any knowledge how to check the quality of their partners, and do not think twice about outsourcing all of these problems that come with this to their own customers. But to get back to the Observer model, this leaves us with another unfortunate revelation about the fixed STL list. You would expect that changes like that would be updated and reflected in the reported models list, so that the people who initially downloaded the model would know to re-download it to the latest version. But there hasn't been any communication about this change anywhere. This begs the question how many other models have been silently updated without informing their backers. The only way to check this is by cross-referencing them with the old models, and overall this reflects extremely poorly on the transparency of their communication. Despite having been informed several times and having had ample time to fix it, Factory Fortress straight up ignores these issues. They downplay the severity and they continue to make the same mistakes. They have been caught actively omitting information or even outright lying about the state of the STLs on several occasions. With that out of the way, let's go over the Brandshield controversy in relation to their newly released community license.
We both wanted to do a game community first. Now, obviously, every single games company and publisher under the sun says that they are making games community first. They just don't mean it. And I know it. I mean, I've been a video game executive for half of my career, 15 years, is and you go to the stage and you lie and you wave and yes, we're doing this for you, while in reality your big boss tells you very clearly you're doing this for money. So we decided that we're going to make a game, we're going to lose all our time, we're going to lose all our money, and we are actually going to make a game the way we want to do. So one of the things we did, that we made the game miniature agnostic. It's a tabletop game. Usually the 95 to 99% of the money you spend on a miniature game are the miniatures. We wanted to pay our sculptors pretty well. Our miniatures are not the cheapest. They are not the expensive by a longest shot, but neither are they the cheapest. But you don't have to buy them. The game officially supports miniatures from any manufacturer. You don't have to buy anything from us. So again, it's the go against what the normal common sense of doing good business does to you.
Before anyone jumps to Crusade defense saying companies have a right to defend their intellectual property, obviously that is correct and nobody is disputing that. If people are straight up selling direct copies of their miniatures, that is wrong. But when innocent people get caught in the crossfire, that is also wrong. Imagine if somebody has a guard dog that then mauls completely innocent people living across the street. It would be ridiculous to say, yes, but people have a right to protect their property, and then ignore any further context, or worse, even say that the victim probably deserved it. And quite frankly, that is exactly what Crusade wants you to believe. Considering Crusade's lofty statements about being miniature agnostic and supporting individual creators, it came as a big surprise when they were called out for enforcing their copyright through a company called Brandshield. This came to light when they were called out by a creator called Diceverse, who is a sculptor that makes STL files for tabletop that can be used for games like Crusade. He claims that his merchants, these are people who pay him a monthly licensing fee that allow him to print and sell his models, were receiving a lot of DMCA takedowns on places like eBay and Etsy. I've been in contact with various people who have received DMCA takedowns and can prove that what Crusade has been doing is not merely protecting their IP, but arguably amounts to DMCA abuse. First of all, DMCA takedowns are a first step of a serious legal procedure. It can ruin people's livelihoods because platforms like eBay and Etsy can and will block and remove people's stores if too many of these strikes comes in. Crusade knows this, as they even allude to it in their license, stating that they are not responsible when that happens. The rules when submitting a DMCA takedown are fairly straightforward. It must include identification of copyrighted work claimed to have been infringed, so for example, for their miniatures they could link to the models on their store or include pictures. It must also include information to help the accused party identify which specific items are to be removed or altered in order to comply. Without sufficient information, the claim is essentially invalid, allowing platforms to deny the takedown or request further information. The confusing part here is that Diceverse has already been told by Crusade developers themselves that they had no issues with his models. He's generally a very well respected member within that community. Apparently the developers literally used his terrain files themselves, so they clearly approve of what he's doing. So the physical models of his designs being sold should in theory also be fine. Diceverse claimed that several of his merchants have been struck for using terms compatible with Crusade, after which he warned them to change this terminology to stay out of trouble. But these are not the only people who have been struck. On Kickstarter's public DMCA list, you can find that on January 15th, 5 different projects received a DMCA strike by Brandshield on behalf of Crusade. And when investigating these claims, you immediately notice that the description of copyright material does not include any examples or links of what is actually being infringed upon. For all 5 takedowns, they literally just used a copy-pasted blanket statement without a further context, clearly in breach of DMCA guidelines. Even a company like Games Workshop usually has the courtesy to provide reference links, and I think it's fair to say that from first impression, it's obvious that Crusade is not operating in good faith here, but we did of course investigate further, and it gets worse. I've been in contact with 4 out of 5 of these sellers, and most did not want me to disclose the private conversations or specifically mention their projects, so I will not do that. However, what I can say is that not a single one of these made one-on-one copies of official models or artwork. They were either intended as proxies or were merely themed to be compatible with Crusade. One of them is literally just a set of Gothic terrain pieces. Their only crime was either mentioning Crusade or a faction related keyword. They did not copy official artwork or models in any way. And for a company that claims to be supportive of individual creators, sending out DMCA claims demanding to remove the entire Kickstarter over such a minor transgression before they even release their own community license seems extremely draconian. Fortunately, all of their projects have been reinstated once they remove these keywords. However, other people, especially those selling on Etsy and eBay, have not been so lucky. it has been confirmed that they also just received copy-pasted statements that are not actually referencing any infringements. The really bad thing for them is that removing Trans Crusade related keywords has not helped much at all to prevent the DMCA takedowns, because those kept streaming in, to the point that one of the merchants I've been in contact with has now received about 40 takedown requests against his eBay shop from Brandshield on behalf of Trans Crusade, despite having sent several emails to Factory Fortress and Brandshield informing them that he is not selling their official models and he is just a merchant. He has not had any meaningful replies. The issue is that despite having removed any Trans Crusade related keywords or compatible with Trans Crusade, the DMCA takedowns just keep streaming in. Initially, this resulted in a temporary 10-day ban on selling. What makes this exceptionally predatory is that after 10 days, Brandshield immediately sends new takedowns to repeat the process. This really shows that this is being used as a strategy to harass people and get their shops taken down, rather than resolve actual infringement. This particular seller is now at a point where eBay told him that if he receives 2 more strikes, they will close his shop, and there is nothing they can do for him. This is a respected seller who has sold over thousands of products and has not had a single negative review in 12 months, by the way. Another seller has even shown me proof that he deliberately stated his miniatures are not associated with Factory Fortress or Trans Crusade. He has even written confirmation from Factory Fortress that they see nothing wrong with his listings, and it still got struck by Brandshield on their behalf. And when he contacted them again, they completely ignored him. By their own admission, Trans Crusade has already sent out 3,000 copyright takedowns over the span of a year, and has demonstrated these are not just against people performing piracy, so it is safe to assume that a lot of sellers are in the same situation. In the community license, they had admitted to using AI for finding and flagging infringing listings, but they clearly stated all takedowns have been done manually. Let me quote, "We do issue takedowns on infringing content and have been doing so for a year now. This is done via a third-party IP protection service. We use this service because it would be impossible for us to do it ourselves. We had to issue almost 3,000 takedowns last year, which is not something our team can handle unless we were to employ a very substantial in-house legal team. For the same reason, it is impossible for us to contact each seller individually to resolve the matter." I find it strange that they deliberately go out of their way not to mention Brandshield, because we already know that that is the party they are working with. Brandshield is a really sketchy IP protection company based in Israel of all places, and before all of this already had a really bad reputation for doing abusive DMCA takedowns on behalf of Games Workshop. Before their statement, I would have at least granted them plausible deniability that Brandshield was just being overzealous, but now that they've expressly stated that all takedowns have been done manually, if there was any doubt, they provided clarification that actually is much worse, because it means they are fully aware of all of this. What makes this even worse is that sellers who do illegally sell the official Trans Crusade miniatures remain completely unaffected by this. There are examples of sellers with listings that literally use the official artwork, names and miniatures that have been available on eBay since November. So that means that over a period of 2.5 months, they have not been taken down whatsoever. Meanwhile, people who try to do the right thing and comply with removal of keywords have been unfairly getting carpet bombed with no recourse. So not only is Brandshield's AI seemingly incapable of flagging actual infringements that any basic Google search will show you, it is actually fraudulently targeting completely legitimate sellers, and Factory Fortress knows exactly what's going on and is absolutely complicit in this. So this is absolute madness. In the license, they are also pearl clutching about their design for the Maximilian class knight, claiming that when they released the artwork, within a week it had been copied and put up for sale with identical unit names, the Trans Crusade name and other copied features. And apparently this is supposed to be such a blatant example of piracy and copyright infringement that they felt it validated specifically mentioning it as an excuse for the copyright crackdown. But if we examine this in detail, the claim actually falls apart. First of all, the artwork itself is already basically a copy of the very first search result when googling for Gothic armor, down to the very post itself. This is a very common historical armor style that just cannot be copyrighted, and the term Maximilian either refers to another set of armor that came after this, or refers to the historically prominent name within German nobility like Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. Obviously, they own the copyright and exclusive distribution to the artwork itself, but due to the many real-life historical references of anything that Trans Crusade makes, claiming similarly named designs are blatant rip-offs is quite a stretch and will require significant proof to hold up in court. To my knowledge, the only actual creative elements of this design is the shield. When searching for these supposed rip-off proxy models of this, I could find 3 examples. The first one is indeed a 1:1 exact copy of their artwork, but the creator himself already stated that he will not be selling or distributing it, and saying that devs will probably release their own version. so that is not an infringement. The second one, while obviously very similar, does not have the shield or the halberd, neither in the artwork or in any of the weapon options within the files themselves. Furthermore, it has only a handful of downloads, 25 at the time of recording to be precise, so to call this an example of rampant piracy threatening their livelihoods would be extremely disingenuous. The final example is so visually distinct from the original design that I also cannot reasonably call this an actual infringement of the artwork. If we go by their own definition of what is apparently too close, then almost nothing they make is original. The Maximilian Knight looks surprisingly similar to the Holy Roman Empire Maccabian Knight model from Golden Dragon games, all the way down to the halberd and the engine on the back. And this guy from the Stosstruppen box looks just way too similar to a Warhammer 40k Dark Angel Space Marine. Not to mention the spike on a Stahlhelm that has been done 1,000 times before. Their designs are definitely not original enough to validate this type of complaint. So all of this just boils down to whether or not they have enough money to hire lawyers to go after people and bully them into compliance.
Independent creators in the gaming space that are very talented, they are hugely passionate, but it is almost impossible for them to make a living because they cannot get the visibility. And we said that we have this intellectual property now that the people like, so how about we let everybody else to use it as well? If you do everything yourself, we just want to check that you don't do anything absolutely barbarous that we can't support, and you can use our IP to sell your own product. Again, we got a lot of warnings from the industry experts and we decided to ignore them all.
In their community license, they attempt to portray themselves like the victims being preyed upon by rampant piracy, just a small team who are reluctantly forced to defend their IP due to a few bad actors in an attempt to protect their livelihood, and that for every single takedown they had no choice but to act and were fully in the right to do so. But knowing what is actually going on, this narrative that they're trying to spin to justify their copyright crackdown is actually just laughable. Crusade raised over $6 million in revenue within half a year, which is even before the plastic miniatures. This clearly shows that if you have the goodwill of the people, they are overwhelmingly willing to pay for the quite expensive prices, and the developers themselves are probably on the verge of becoming millionaires themselves. I have nothing against people being more than adequately compensated for their work, but a couple rich guys who have done nothing but underdeliver, whining about their livelihood which they've extracted from the goodwill of people through repeated misleading and broken promises, while simultaneously ruthlessly destroying the livelihoods of innocent people they tricked into thinking that Crusade was a welcoming IP for individual creators, is just extremely hypocritical and quite frankly morally reprehensible. The crazy thing about this is that one of the main developers is on record in several public presentations for saying that he did not want to make a tabletop game that is a walled garden for rich people, and that when the team first started making the game, they were completely fine with never making any money.
I don't want to build a game that is a walled garden only for rich people.
When Mike and I sat down, we decided we will do none of those things. We'll do the absolute opposite what you're supposed to do. And when I talked to Mike first time, when he proposed that, hey, I've been working the visuals of this world, would you like to make a game for it? I said to Mike, are you prepared to lose all that time and money? And he said, hell yeah. And I said, okay, we can do business, because I was just as sick and tired of having these creative turnipseeds to tell us how to make games. Finally, I found out that if the people actually genuinely like the game without you coercing them or paying them or advertising to them, they will buy the game anyway. There's a big difference here between free-to-play and giving a game away for free. Free-to-play is a system where people start playing your game, and in order to proceed, usually that's when you have to pay. It's a very common and very popular business model. This is very different.
It has become apparent that one by one, they're breaking their initial promises to ensure the maximum amount of profits and control in the future. They have already succumbed to the argument that they must incentivize store owners as an excuse to stop releasing new STL files and only release new factions in plastic. These things could easily coexist, so it's just fallacious reasoning. Obviously, they're not going to stop selling the STL files that are already on their shop, because the files are already out there. We all know the real reason for not releasing any new factions has nothing to do with the different manufacturing systems, as any model made for injection models can also be 3D printed. The reason they chose not to release these as digital files is because they think it will be more profitable. They promised a miniature agnostic setting where third-party miniatures would always be welcome and completely legitimate. This promise is just about absolutely meaningless already. In their official painting competition that they've recently announced, they've explicitly stated that for 5 out of the 6 categories, people are only allowed to use the official miniatures. This leaves only one category open for third-party sculpts, which, considering their earlier statements, comes across as just a token gesture for them to still being able to claim miniature agnostic. This is very much just a boiling the frog type of situation, where they will continue to try to weasel their way out of their initial promises one step at a time. So it remains to be seen how long their promise that you can use any miniature you want in their tournaments will hold up. And I bet that when they eventually stop supporting that, it will happen the exact same way. The community license in itself is nothing more than the developers restating their own copyrights. You were not allowed to touch or use anything even remotely close to their IP. It doesn't grant their community any rights whatsoever. It doesn't even matter if you're doing it for free or not. The weird thing is that since you are not allowed to mention or use or base it on anything that has anything to do with French Crusade in the first place, the license doesn't even apply to anything. And that is how we get to the actual compatible with French Crusade license, which is also extremely limiting, and the only thing it grants creators is the right to put compatible with French Crusade on their items. This comes with a boatload of caveats to potentially be used against you, because by applying for this, you submit yourself to their basic community license, which for example contains clauses that explicitly allows them to use your work however they want. I quote, "You agree that we may use, copy, modify, distribute or make derivative works of your project on a royalty-free, non-exclusive, irrevocable, transferable, sub-licensable, worldwide basis for any purpose and without having to credit you, pay you anything or obtain your approval." So obviously as a creative this is extremely bad, because you grant them the right to steal your work wherever and however they please. Obviously the developers know this, so they then try to sugarcoat it with another paragraph. That's a lot of scary words there, but to clarify, this does not mean that we own anything you make, just that we can share it in different formats, such as on social media, community gallery and on our website. We're consistently blown away by some of the amazing things our community puts out, and sometimes we want to share and amplify the ones that impresses the most. Also, despite this clause, we always try to reach out to ask for permission to share projects and always give credit whenever possible. I think it's interesting to note that they will try to reach out for permission and give credits, but this means that if you don't respond, they can just give themselves permission to do so anyway. They also demand you conduct yourself according to their personal moral standards and politics, and if you ever say anything too critical about French Crusade, that will be reason to revoke your third-party license and force you to take down your models. Overall, everything in the license is designed for French Crusade to claim the maximum rights, while granting the community absolutely nothing. They want to hold absolute control over the individual creators and basically just outright dissuade people from making proxy models for French Crusade in the first place. Since you cannot use any of their titles to describe your models, it becomes a very tiresome game of cat and mouse to find ambiguous names so that people know what it is intended for, but French Crusade will not be able to come after you legally. You never have any guarantee of safety unless you agree to their horrible one-sided terms, which they can also change or revoke if they no longer like you. And if you get in the way or become a liability to their corporate goals, one way or another, you can be sure you will get absolutely screwed. In comparison, a real license would apply permanently to the work from the moment it was approved, or at the very least for a guaranteed period of time. Anything else will just open the door for copyright trolling in the future. For example, what happens on YouTube when people buy the license to music and then start stealing the monetization of creators by claiming these videos. Perhaps the current day factory fortress won't do this, but there's no guarantee what will happen if they suddenly feel incentivized to do so, or think that they can get away with it. And it seems that they have deliberately gone out of their way to not grant people any rights or security. So yes, I don't think it's actually that useful to argue about the context or the semantics of their community license itself, because in the end its entire usefulness depends on whether or not you can trust the developers to be good people who will hold their words of being supportive of individual creators, which they've already demonstrated they will not. Any changes to the license in reaction to a public response is just performative to make it seem like they are listening to feedback, when they're really not. I know this because they have received feedback on this license from several creators before releasing the license publicly, despite being told repeatedly that claiming compatible with French Crusade was a bad idea and that they should use a more exclusive label like approved by French Crusade instead. They were insistent to go ahead anyway. Diceverse has been in direct contact and always on good terms with the creators, despite having previously been told that his stuff was fine and would be approved. Once he actually applied for the compatible French Crusade license, had pretty much 99% of his entire range of miniatures denied, with the developers demanding he change almost all of the names and remove several listings due to them claiming it is too close, and I quote, "Me contacting them did not go exactly very well, rather it went very bad. In addition to them denying practically all of my opportunities for Transcrusade compatible, here's a summary of claims and statements by Factory Fortress. I was very surprised that as a sculptor who has made trench style miniatures and terrain since beginning of the game, they still instantly demand removal of these STLs without any sort of discussion. In a situation where I approached them on my own accord and out of goodwill, this does not seem very cooperative or building bridge type of behavior. In a situation where I've offered to help them in multiple occasions behind the scenes, and my intentions have never been to hurt or bring harm to them. Clearly the developers either had a change of heart regarding what would be allowed, or they are trying to punish Diceverse for publishing the information that Transcrusade was hiring Brandshield to target its merchants, and considering the following statement, it definitely seems like an act of pettiness on their behalf. I had thought my rangers would be fine, as in similar cases people have been granted licenses. Wargames Crew also has the compatibility license, and their designs operate in the same space as mine, original sculpts that can fit into the Transcrusade universe. So yeah, obviously it doesn't come as much of a surprise that Transcrusade would approve projects for the license inconsistently and exclude creators for petty reasons. As a history enthusiast, I find this one really bothering. The main developer has not just once but repeatedly claimed how history is really important to his work and has a tendency to present himself as somewhat of an expert.
In the case of a war game like this, the history gives you a lot of avenues that you thought were not there. You can go and bring other things than the Western Knight into a historical game. Don't get me wrong, I love Western Knights. We have lots of them in the Trench Crusade, but you can do other things too. But you do need to realize that you have to do your research. My rule for including the Middle Eastern African cultures was that you don't slander, don't pander, treat them like everybody else. So don't try to fake it, you have to do research. And I started looking at the Ethiopian Orthodox Church or the Golden Age of Islam, that I'm basically newborn. So I had to have enough humility to start studying from the bottom. You can't cut corners, because people will find you out.
He specifically said that for Transcrusade, one of its main principles when presenting different historical cultures is not to slander or to pander, which yeah, in principle, I absolutely agree with. However, when listening to some of his interviews, I started to notice him making a lot of sketchy claims that he presents as absolute historical fact.
World War I was, apart from in the real history, a humongous human strategy. But from point of view of a war game designer, you literally had people with horses, lances, full armor charging, while there were planes, bombers, zeppelins, poison gas, night vision, machine guns.
Really weird period of time.
Yeah, where
like
the medieval
strange,
met super, because they had some weapons the most advanced chemical weapons ever deployed were in World War I. We haven't dared to touch them again.
So he seems to be absolutely sure that during World War I they had night vision machine guns or something similar, because he mentioned it twice.
Night vision, machine guns,
really
night vision.
weird.
As someone who knows a lot about World War I myself, this immediately sounded extremely questionable, and so far the only mention of something like this that I could find is an extremely sketchy article that's probably AI generated and mislabels the World War II Sturmgewehr 1943 Zielgerät infrared night vision scope as a World War I invention, with the picture also being immediately recognizable as a World War II German uniform. Then in the same interview, he goes on with an extremely questionable anecdote.
And you had all these ancients, the hereditary knights from the Russian Empire. They came with full chainmail and swords, and they were deadly, because in the trench raiding, where the German Empire stormtroopers came from, this was all about the mad dash at dark and then kill the other guys with clubs and knives.
It's terrifying.
And the spiked gauntlets, because it was faster than the using rifles. Take a long time.
Here he is clearly referring to a story of the Gregorian group of Kefsurian soldiers who indeed still wore ceremonial chainmail during this time. There is somewhat of an urban legend that these people showed up in Russia during the First World War to come fight on the front. However, there is very little if no proof that this actually happened, and especially the idea that these people would charge into battle with their traditional armor and weapons like medieval knights is just absolutely preposterous. Furthermore, he presents the idea that people often use spike gauntlets in close quarter combat during trench raids. World War I did see a lot of creative close quarter weapons, but this spike gauntlet in particular was mostly just an experimental design, and there is little to no proof that this one was actually used in battle. I don't know where this guy gets his sources from, but his proclivity to present these stories as factual discredits his own claim of being very knowledgeable and sincere about history.
Their Orthodox Church tradition. They were, by the way, Ethiopia has been Christian longer than any European country, except maybe Armenia, 400 years longer than the English, for example, who then sent a lot of missionaries there. We are coming to convert you into Christianity. We've been Christian like 400 years longer than you. Why do you come to convert us? We already are Christians.
This claim about Ethiopia being the very first Christian kingdom, long before Europe became Christian, is actually quite misleading. If we take England as his example, Christianity actually first reached England through the Romans during the 2nd and 3rd century. The reason why Ethiopia is considered one of the first official Christian states is because around the early 4th century, the king himself converted to Christianity and decided to make it the state religion. So overnight this marked Ethiopia officially as a Christian kingdom, but for a long time this did not actually reflect adoption in the wider population, whose majority continued to worship their original religion. Similarly to how Christianity and paganism coexisted in Britain. In comparison, Rome and by extension parts of Europe saw a rise in Christianity a lot earlier, and despite repeated bans and persecutions of Christians, adopted it much more naturally. Christianity became the state religion of Rome only 50 years later than Ethiopia, with Christianity already being imperially supported by Constantine before that. And the Gauls and several European peoples adopted Christianity roughly around the same time and rate as the Ethiopians did. With the rise of Islam, Ethiopia gained actually quite a significant portion of Muslim population, especially in the south, which in the 16th century led to a civil war that the Christian Ethiopians were losing. They then requested military aid from Europe and were helped by Catholic Portuguese, who helped in keeping Christianity as the state religion of Ethiopia. The initial European missionaries that were going to Ethiopia were Catholics and were trying to convert Orthodox Christians over to Catholicism. And in the 17th century, they successfully converted the Emperor of Ethiopia, which made Catholicism temporarily the official state religion, but this time it failed to gain a foothold in the wider population, who remained Orthodox. And when the English during the 19th century sent their missionaries, it was to convert them over to Protestantism, in which they proved remarkably successful. This chain of events is now reflected in the religious demographic of the country, with 44% being Orthodox Christians, 22% being Protestants and 31% Islamic. So to frame it in a way that make it seem like Ethiopia was always uniformly Christian, and that the English adopted Christianity a whole 400 years later, only to then send a bunch of idiotic missionaries over in their ignorant attempt to convert them to Christianity, seems deliberately misleading and is actually the definition of slandering and pandering. For someone who presents himself as somewhat of an expert and continues emphasizing the importance of authentic representation of different cultures, the blatant misinformation and slander of European culture presented as fact is very discrediting and shows his tendency to just make up a narrative. The shipping of products continues to be an absolute shitshow all the way in 2026. Miniatures continue to arrive with broken parts, which, considering that they once promised these things could literally be dropped from the stairs without breaking, is just ridiculous. Another whole fuck up that I just discovered is that the dice trays from Baron of Dice have blatant print errors with the text mirrored, which was already an issue that customers reported 5 months ago, yet they are still being shipped out with the very same issue to this very day. And when people contact them, they are being told that they can ship them some stickers to cover up the error. And of course, not a single refund in sight. Sure, many people have gotten their products, but God only knows how many hundreds of people have now completely given up on getting the stuff they paid for. If I had received broken miniatures delivered 3 times in a row, still haven't received shipping information for the outdated rulebook, forced to pay import taxes on these replacements, and told for the 1000th time to contact customer support about all of this, then yeah, I would probably also have just given up.
There are things you need to do then if you want to do this. You have to keep your word. You can't always. Sometimes things happen. Sometimes a product is late. Just be transparent. People get it if you're honest. Don't be an asshole. If you treat people badly, it will come back to haunt you. Choose a long-term health of your community or short-term gain. Sometimes that means some challenging decisions. Sometimes you can't please everyone, so try to be as fair as you can. You can change the industry for better. I believe that I'm hoping that our example will inspire others, because I think what we've shown is that you can both have some morals and still be financially successful. I think the communities that the appreciated, respected, helped, is the nurtured, are more resilient and they live longer than the communities that eventually figure out that how the game company sees you is just something that you squeeze money out of. I just think there are other ways to do it than just looking at people and seeing just wallets and that's it. I don't have any investors, so I don't have to listen to anybody.
It's just tragic that they managed to fool so many people into believing their promises, only for them to do the exact opposite. Despite repeatedly stating how important these principles were to them, that they would never break them, once push came to shove and real money was on the line, they had no problem breaking these promises and screwing over the people that supported them. When it comes to their community license, which entirely relies on good faith for them not to screw you over, it would be extremely foolish to trust a company that is proven to act in bad faith on pretty much every single occasion. Factory forces are extremely calculating and predatory. At least public companies are forced to listen to their uncaring shareholders and always maximize profits. Crusade does not have investors holding the proverbial gun to their head. They could have done anything they wanted with their IP for the benefit of their own community, and instead chose to take everything away from them instead. All in all, there is really no telling how much further damage they are willing to inflict upon their backers, customers and community. Crusade does not deserve the benefit of the doubt, and any self-respecting person would stay the fuck away from this company and their broken franchise. The truly sad thing is, in their lore they actually have a quote from a demon called Mammon that says, "I will make you so poor that in the end you will have nothing but money." And ironically, this seems to perfectly describe the path the developers have taken. Crusade really has no one else to blame but themselves. And quite frankly, I think the developers should be ashamed.